Hello everyone. Before we get started, make sure to like and subscribe and leave a comment saying where you're from and when you watched. That way, YouTube will continue to show you stories like this. Now, let's get started. Asterisk, the neighborhood I live in is on the edge of town, so peaceful that people often forget it ever existed on the map. Small bluestone streets, trees rustling in the wind, and roofs that are as still as if nothing had ever happened. But at the end of that street is house number 44. The house is always closed, old, covered in dust and moss, as if no one had cleaned it for decades. But what makes people shiver is not its appearance. It is the deaths. 7 families, 7 tragedies. All died in the same position, lying on their backs on the living room floor, eyes wide open, arms outstretched, and strange smiles carved into their faces. The government once sealed the house, but then a few years later it was put up for sale. Strangely, the buyers were always small families, never suspecting anything, and they died in the same position. The press once made a big deal about it, calling it the curse of house number 44. But then everything fell silent. Gradually, no one dared to mention it anymore, as if forgetting was the only way to live in peace. My name is Ethan. I am one of the crazy ones. I bought that house. I am not superstitious. I am a photographer, specializing in recording abandoned places, haunted stories, as people call them. Places that used to be mental hospitals, old prisons, haunted schools. I believe that each photo can retain the aftershock of emotions of things that once existed. But house number 44 gave me a different feeling, as if it was ... waiting. The day I moved in, my neighbors only looked at me with pity. No one said hello. I don't blame them. Everyone has a reason to be afraid. But I didn't. Not until the first night. Around 2 a.m., as I was editing photos on my computer, I heard footsteps coming from downstairs. I was alone. I thought it might be a cat or a mouse, but the sound was steady, like leather shoes scraping against an old wooden floor. I walked down the stairs, my heart pounding. The air was cold even though the windows were closed. When I entered the living room where the deaths had occurred, everything was strangely quiet, but I knew something was wrong. On the dusty wooden floor were ... footprints clear, fresh, leading from the front door to the middle of the living room and ending there. No trace of turning back. No one in the house. I shivered. I felt like someone was watching me from behind, even though I knew no one was there. I couldn't sleep all night. The next morning, I tried to rationalize everything. Maybe it was the homeless person who had been hiding in the house, or maybe I imagined it. I turned on the camera, intending to capture the ruins for my project. But the first photo left me speechless. In the photo of the living room, in the middle, there was a faint figure standing, so faint that it seemed like a lens defect. But when I zoomed in, what made my blood run cold was that figure was smiling, a smile identical to the victims in the case file. I quickly checked the camera, again no one. The second, third, and all were empty. Only the first photo. That night, I heard footsteps again. This time, there was a whisper, very small, not sure what language it was, but it echoed in my head like a call from the bottom of a well. I took out the tape recorder, turned it on, and left it in the middle of the room. When I listened to it again the next morning, I almost dropped it when I discovered the sound on the tape. A female voice, hoarse, speaking very slowly. "We're still here, ... The words seemed to penetrate my mind. I started having strange dreams. 7 figures lying on the floor, their eyes staring at me like they were intruders. I woke up in a cold sweat, my arms bruised as if someone had squeezed them in my sleep. But I lived alone. I started digging deeper. I opened old files, and I found something the newspapers didn't mention. Every family that had lived in the house had moved in on April 4th. April 4th, house number 44. A coincidence? No, it was intentional. I checked the calendar and realized tomorrow was April. For my stomach twisted, I should leave, but something in the back of my mind whispered to me that I couldn't leave anymore. The house wouldn't let me. And that night of April 3rd, I decided to set up a camera and record the whole night. If something happened, I wanted to record it, to prove that this is one of the true scary stories. I wanted to expose the truth, but I didn't expect what I recorded would make me wish I had never set foot in house number 44. To be continued in episode 2. If you are satisfied with part 1, I will continue with part 2, episode 2, right away. Each episode will keep the creepy style, insert keywords, as you requested, and still be safe with YouTube community guidelines. Can you confirm? Hello everyone. Before we get started, make sure to like and subscribe, and leave a comment saying where you're from and when you watched. That way, YouTube will continue to show you stories like this. Now, let's get started. Asterisk, I spent the whole day of April 4th preparing. I had cleaned the living room where the camera would be placed since early morning. I tried to keep my mind clear, telling myself that this was just a psychological experiment. But as the hours passed, I felt like the house was changing. The air became more stuffy. Sunlight could no longer penetrate the windows. Dust in the room swirled in the invisible cold wind. I placed a camera in the middle of the living room facing the door. The night camera was fully charged. I also attached a separate microphone to record every sound. I checked everything 3 times and then retreated to the bedroom upstairs. The clock read 11:50 p.m. I watched the clock as the minutes passed. When the hands pointed to exactly 12 o'clock, I began to hear the first noise. Footsteps, soft at first, slow, then clearer. They came from the hallway downstairs. I opened my phone to see what the camera was recording. The screen was dim, but I could still see the light in the living room flickering. Then right in the middle of the frame was a blurry figure. Tall and thin, standing still, looking towards the camera. I was stunned. There was no sound of the door opening. No one had come in from outside, but the figure was still clearly visible. I tried to regain my composure and zoomed in. The figure began to move, not walk, but drift across the room. When the figure touched the camera, the image began to distort. There was a buzzing sound in the microphone, as if hundreds of voices were overlapping each other, whispering something. I couldn't understand. Then the camera lost signal. I rushed downstairs with a flashlight. The room was dark. The camera was still, recording, but the screen was filled with white noise. I couldn't see anyone, but the scent in the room had changed. The musty smell of the old house was now pungent with a burning smell, as if something had burned from inside the walls. I felt a chill down my spine, as if someone had just suffocated the air in the room. I checked the camera again. All the data was still there, but the recording time was cut off right when the shadow appeared near the camera. I decided to extract the video to my computer to watch it more closely the next morning. But that night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed with my eyes wide open. In the darkness, I heard someone calling my name, clearly, over and over again. Daniel, Daniel, Daniel. Every time the call rang out, I felt the house shake slightly, as if it were breathing. I was paralyzed and couldn't move. A cold feeling spread from the back of my neck to my feet. A familiar voice rang in my ears. Again we found why I don't remember when I fell asleep. The next morning, I woke up with scratches on my wrists. Exactly like the bruises I had seen in my dream. I rushed to the computer to open the video to watch. The footage was very clear at first, but at the 13th minute, the image started to shake. A red dot appeared in the corner of the room. From there, a shadow began to appear. Slowly, slowly, each step forward caused the camera to get more. Grainy eye froze at the moment the figure passed the camera. In the few frames before the signal was cut off, I saw a face, white, no eyes, a smile that stretched from ear to ear. The smile matched the police description of the victims. I backed away from my seat. Goosebumps rose all over my body. I knew I had just witnessed something that could not be explained by logic or science. There was no doubt about it. There was something real about this house. It was not a rumor. It was not a legend. It was one of those true, scary stories, and I was the next one chosen to see it. But why wasn't I dead like the others? Was it because I hadn't fully entered that loop? Or was there something else waiting for me? I knew I couldn't leave, not because I didn't want to, but because I could sense the house wouldn't let me. Every time I was about to pack up and leave, some strange event would happen that would make me stay. It was like it was controlling my decisions. That night I decided to do something more daring. I would try to talk to the entity in the house. I would ask questions, and I wanted answers. Watch the next episode to see what happens when I try to contact the spirit in house number 44. Hello, everyone. Before we get started, make sure to like and subscribe, and leave a comment saying where you're from and when you watched. That way, YouTube will continue to show you stories like this. Now, let's get started. Asterisk, I spent the afternoon preparing for my first contact with the thing that was hiding in this house. I wasn't sure if it was a vengeful spirit or some other undefined entity. I only knew one thing: it had intelligence. It watched me, understood me, and wanted me to stay. I placed an old wooden chair in the middle of the living room, exactly where the victims had been found dead. The tape recorder was placed right on my lap. I lit a single candle to keep the space just enough light, but still keep the darkness from enveloping. The cold feeling gradually spread from the wooden floor up my spine. As I sat down, I pressed the record button and began to speak in a calm voice, even though my heart was pounding like a drum. If someone was here, I wanted to talk. I didn't come to harm or scare them away. I just wanted to understand why these things were happening. The silence lasted for almost 2 minutes. Suddenly, the candle flickered. Even though the doors were closed, there was no wind. The surrounding air thickened, as if something was pressing me down. I heard a very soft whisper behind me. I turned my head. Nothing. I asked again, "Are you one of the 7 families who lived here?" At this moment, the candle went out completely. The room was plunged into darkness. I heard a heavy breathing in the corner. Then a small voice rang out behind my ear. No, it was Ali. Froze in place. The voice was unclear whether male or female, rang out like a cold air passing through the back of my neck. I shook my hand and turned on the flashlight. The phone didn't turn on the screen. The recorder was still working. I asked again, "What do you want me to know?" Footsteps began to echo in the house from the hallway to the kitchen, and then back to the living room. I felt like someone was circling me, circle by circle, closer and closer. The voice rang out again, but this time it was clearer. We were called, we didn't choose this place. I couldn't understand the full meaning of the words, but I knew that they weren't souls who had lived here for a long time, but people who had been sucked into this place. Maybe it was because of some ritual or curse that forced them to stay forever. I took a deep breath and asked, who called you guys there? Was no answer, only a soft laugh echoed from every corner of the wall. That laugh had no emotion, not happy, not angry, but empty, as if coming from an old speaker. Suddenly the window opened, even though I had closed it tightly since the afternoon. The cold wind rushed in and knocked the tape recorder off my lap. I bent down to pick it up and saw a clear handprint on the dusty floor right in front of me. It felt like someone had just touched the floor. To crawl closer to May stepped back in fear. My heart pounding, the smell in the air changed suddenly. A stench, like a decomposing corpse, filled the room. I mustered up the courage to ask loudly, "Are you guys being forced to die?" Here a series of sounds rang out. The tape recorder made an unpleasant screech and then automatically turned off. I stood up to relight the candle, but the fire wouldn't catch. Suddenly, I felt a hot breath right on the back of my neck. I turned around, but there was no one at that moment. I knew I had crossed some kind of boundary, the boundary between observation and intervention, between a witness and part of the story. Left the living room in a state of panic. Every step I took felt like someone was watching. Every time I turned around, I saw the light in the room dimming, then intensifying, as if something was waiting for me to return. I listened to the recording again the next morning. In it, a very clear voice said one last sentence before the machine turned off. "You've started and you can't stop anymore." That voice was no longer creepy, but carried resignation and despair. Like a warning from someone who went before me, but it could also be from my future self, sent to the past. I can't leave this house until everything is over. I will continue to investigate. I need to know who started all this. Watch the next episode to see what happens when I discover a secret room that has never been mentioned in any records. Hello everyone. Before we get started, make sure to like and subscribe, and leave a comment saying where you're from and when you watched. That way, YouTube will continue to show you stories like this. Now, let's get started. Asterisk, I couldn't stop thinking about the last sentence in the recording. He had started and couldn't stop anymore. That voice carried an unnameable fear. It felt like I had accidentally touched something that had been sealed for a long time, and it didn't want to be awake. Next morning, I decided to thoroughly check the entire structure of the house. I contacted the City Archives office to ask for the original design drawings of house number 44. The old file was delivered after 2 days of waiting, and when I opened it, I immediately realized something strange. The original drawing. There was a small rectangular room located between the kitchen and the spare bedroom, but when I checked, in reality, there wasn't any door leading to that room. I measured it again with a laser ruler, and there was indeed a hidden space behind the kitchen wall. A space more than 2 meters long and more than 1.5 meters wide. I felt a chill down my spine. No one designs a sealed room without a reason. I started looking for cracks or gaps in the wall. After a few knocks everywhere, I discovered a section of the wall made a hollow sound more than the rest. It was behind the moldy dish. Rakai moved the shelf and touched the plaster. Very unusual. The wall here was not a solid brick, but was plastered with a layer of cement of a different color than the rest. Someone had rebuilt this part to hide something. I took a hammer and hit it a few times. The mortar started to fall off in pieces. Each hit felt like hitting my heart. I didn't know what was behind that wall, but I had the feeling it was listening to me coming. Each piece of brick broke to reveal a wooden wall behind old and moldy. I tapped lightly The wall shook, a hollow sound came out. I pushed the wooden door gently, but it got stuck. I used my shoulder to hit it hard. The rotten wooden door broke completely. Before my eyes was a small, dark room with no windows and no ventilation. A strong, musty smell rushed straight to my nose, but it wasn't the smell of time, but it was the smell of death. I turned on the flashlight. Inside the room was a small wooden table and a single chair, and a painting hung crookedly on the wall. The painting was covered with dust, but the image was still visible. A man standing with 7 shadowy figures lying around him. All of them were lying on their backs with their arms outstretched, and smiling faces exactly like the postures of the 7 dead families. Shivered underneath the painting was a fake window nailed shut from the inside. I walked closer and looked through the cracks and saw a small piece of paper stuck in it. I carefully removed it. On the paper was written a line in faded red ink. They came from the call and would not leave until someone replaced them. I read that sentence over and over again with a sinking heart. Who were they who called them, and could the replacement be May? Hurried out of that room and went back to study the painting more closely. I took a picture and sent it to a friend who worked in the Symbology Institute. After a few hours, he called back in a bewildered voice. The painting was a simulation of an ancient summoning ritual using the number 7 as the main element, symbolizing the 7 spiritual levels, souls, and the transition between worlds. This room is clearly not meant to be lived in. It is a place for ritual. A ritual that requires sacrifice, a ritual that is hidden from all official blueprints. I began to understand all families move in on the 4th of April, for 4 is 8, divided by 2 is 4, to 4s appear together as a symbol to start a loop, and I have been in that loop since I set foot in this house that night when I slept. A knock sounded from the wall that had just been broken. I lay still. My ears heard each knock 3 times, then stopped, then 3 more times. Rhythmically, like a Kali, understood that they were waiting for me to return to that room. They were not hiding anymore. They were waiting, and I knew I would have to return to finish, or to become a new part of that picture. Watch the next episode to see what happens when I step back into the secret room and face what is waiting in the dark. Hello everyone. Before we get started, make sure to like and subscribe, and leave a comment saying where you're from and when you watched. That way, YouTube will continue to show you stories like this. Now, let's get started. Asterisk, I couldn't sleep that night, even though my body was tired. My mind was tied to the whispers coming from the wall of the secret room. Each knock seemed to call me back like a beat, not of the heart but of the house itself. Early in the morning, I prepared everything to return. I brought a flashlight stronger, then a jar of rock salt from the old temple, and a small camera strapped to my chest to record everything I saw. If anything happened, at least there would be evidence. When I entered that doorless room, the air felt thick, the walls were still cold and musty, and the smell of rotting flesh was still strong. I shined the light around the room, but this time I saw something I hadn't seen the day before. On the damp wooden floor appeared traces like symbols someone had carved into the dust with the tip of a finger, 7 circles intertwined with an unknown symbol in the middle. I took a picture and walked to the old table where the creepy painting hung. When I got closer, I realized the painting had changed. It was no longer the man standing in the middle, 7 more shadows, but a person sitting opposite is me. I don't know how, but the face in the painting is exactly like me looking back at myself. Fi pulled back the flashlight, vibrating with the rapid breathing. I turned back towards the door and saw that it had been closed for a while. I didn't hear the closing sound. I just knew I was locked up. A gunny tried to calm down. retreated to the wall, and used the light to shine around at the corner of the room, I saw a shadow sitting at the table, hand on chin. Head tilted, looking at me as if it had been waiting for a long time. I tried to step closer, but with each step, the space seemed to be stretched. I could never get close to it. Asked who are youth, there was no answer. But the flashlight flickered and then went out completely in the darkness. I felt the breath on my face. A damp and cold feeling. I heard a whisper in my head, not through the ears, not through the sound we used to be youth. The voice couldn't distinguish clearly if it was one person or many. It echoed back into my brain, each word, each sentence, like it was digging into some memory I couldn't control. Oki looked down at the floor, where the 7 circles were emitting a dim light. And in the middle of them was me. The figure was still sitting motionless, as if my presence was the last piece for some ritual to be completed. Shouted, "No, I don't belong here." The flashlight turned on again in a split second, and I realized the room was empty. The figure disappeared, the painting returned to normal, the door to the room was wide open. Cold wind rushed in as if it had just been released, ran outside and closed the door and secured it with a chair and chain. But I knew it was only temporary. I had seen too much and felt too clearly the existence of the entity living in this house that night. I didn't go back to my bedroom. I sat on the chair in the middle of the living room and turned on all the lights around, and the camera was still running all night. I didn't dare close my eyes, because every time I closed my eyes, I saw myself sitting in that room, looking at myself, realized I had stepped deeper into the loop of true horror stories with no way out. I didn't know if I could escape it or not. Will become the next part of the painting hanging on the wall of that room. I need to find out more about the first owner of the house. I need to know who built it and why there is a room that is not in any official blueprint. Stay tuned for the next episode to see what happens when I find out the identity of the first owner and the horrifying truth about the purpose of house number 44. Hello everyone. Before we get started, make sure to like and subscribe, and leave a comment saying where you're from and when you watched. That way, YouTube will continue to show you stories like this. Now, let's get started. Asterisk, I knew that if I continued to stay in the house without understanding its past, I would gradually lose myself like those who had gone before. So I decided to leave the house for a day and go to the city's civil archives to find information about the first owner who had lived here. It took me nearly 2 hours to search through the dusty paper archives. I finally found the name of the first man to register ownership of house number 44 in 1952. His name was Thomas Laird, a strange name for an area with all indigenous people. This man moved from somewhere else and built the house on a vacant lot that had previously been abandoned. After a fire in 1947, I flipped through the records and discovered something unusual. Thomas had no wife, no children, no relatives noted in the records. Everything was blank, and even the portrait was blurred as if it had been erased or burned. The scary thing was that after Thomas moved in, he had never registered to leave or sell back to the house, but after 1956, all information about him disappeared completely. I asked the office staff if anyone had ever investigated this matter. She looked at me with a bewildered look and whispered, "There was a journalist who asked about Thomas in 1982, but then that person did not return and the press did not publish any related articles." I wrote down all the information and asked for copies of the remaining documents. Returning to the house in the afternoon, I felt the atmosphere was different. The sunlight falling on the windows seemed to be warped. Each of my steps echoed in the house, not like a normal sound, but like someone was repeating the footsteps behind me. I opened the files spread out on the living room table. When I turned to the last page, I discovered a piece of news that had been sandwiched between two old sheets of paper. The yellowed newspaper clipping was printed in 1955. The headline was large and bold: the mysterious man suspected of being involved in a series of strange disappearances in the area. The content of the article described how during the 2 years he lived here, Thomas had reported by neighbors many times because of the screams coming from the house at night. Delivery people did not dare to go to the door because of the unbearable stench, but every time the police came, he was not home or refused to see. Then the article ended with a sentence that sent a chill down my spine. Maybe he did not live alone. I put the article down and looked around the house. Everything was still quiet, but I felt something awakening from those words. Maybe Thomas never left here. Maybe he was still alive or had become a part of this place. I took out his old photo and compared it with the face in the painting hanging in the secret room, faint but with a very clear resemblance. I did not know how, but I was sure that person had recorded himself in that ritual as a demonic mark. That night I did not turn on the lights. I sat in the dark with the file spread out in front of me and the tape recorder placed in the middle of the room. I just asked one simple question: Thomas, are you here? After 10 minutes of silence, suddenly the window shook violently, the flashlight turned on randomly, and the tape recorder made a small crackling sound. I waited, and then a hoarse voice rang out in the speaker. Not loud, not clear, but definitely a groan: Mancy never left. Choked, and my body stiffened. I knew I had touched the core of the problem. He never left house number 44. He was here from the beginning. He was the one who called the souls here to do something that I could not understand. I had to know more. I needed to know what he did in this house in the early years. I will go back to the past in a different way. Watch the next episode to see what happens when I find the diary hidden in the floor of the secret room, and the truth almost drives me crazy. Hello everyone. Before we get started, make sure to like and subscribe and leave a comment saying where you're from and when you watched. That way, YouTube will continue to show you stories like this. Now, let's get started. Asterisk, I knew that if I continued to stay in the house without understanding its past, I would gradually lose myself like those who had gone before. So I decided to leave the house for a day and go to the city's civil archives to find information about the first owner who had lived here. It took me nearly 2 hours to search through the dusty paper archives. I finally found the name of the first man to register ownership of house number 44 in 1952. His name was Thomas Laird, a strange name for an area with all indigenous people. This man moved from somewhere else and built the house on a vacant lot that had previously been abandoned. After a fire in 1947, I flipped through the records and discovered something unusual. Thomas had no wife, no children, no relatives noted in the records. Everything was blank, and even the portrait was blurred as if it had been erased or burned. The scary thing was that after Thomas moved in, he had never registered to leave or sell back to the house, but after 1956, all information about him disappeared. Completely, I asked the office staff if anyone had ever investigated this matter. She looked at me with a bewildered look and whispered, "There was a journalist who asked about Thomas in 1982, but then that person did not return and the press did not publish any related articles." I wrote down all the brief information and asked for copies of the remaining documents. Returning to the house in the afternoon, I felt the atmosphere was different. The sunlight falling on the window seemed to be warped. Each of my steps echoed in the house, not like a normal sound, but like someone was repeating the footsteps behind me. I opened the files spread out on the living room table. When I turned to the last page, I discovered a piece of news that had been sandwiched between two old sheets of paper. The yellowed newspaper clipping was printed in 1955. The headline was large and bold: "The mysterious man suspected of being involved in a series of strange disappearances in the area." The content of the article described how during the 2 years he lived here, Thomas had reported by neighbors many times because of the screams coming from the house at night. Delivery people did not dare to go to the door because of the unbearable stench, but every time the police came, he was not home or refused to see. Then the article ended with a sentence that sent a chill down my spine. Maybe he did not live alone. I put the article down and looked around the house. Everything was still quiet, but I felt something awakening from those words. Maybe Thomas never left here. Maybe he was still alive or had become a part of this place. I took out his old photo and compared it with the face in the painting hanging in the secret room, faint, but with a very clear resemblance. I did not know how, but I was sure that person had recorded himself in that ritual as a demonic mark. That night, I did not turn on the lights. I sat in the dark with the file spread out in front of me and the tape recorder placed in the middle of the room. I just asked one simple question: "Thomas, are you here?" After 10 minutes of silence, suddenly the window shook violently, the flashlight turned on randomly, and the tape recorder made a small crackling sound. I waited, and then a hoarse voice rang out in the speaker, not loud, not clear, but definitely a grown man's "never left." I choked, and my body stiffened. I knew I had touched the core of the problem. He never left house number 44. He was here from the beginning. He was the one who called the souls here to do something that I could not understand. I had to know more. I needed to know what he did in this house in the early years. I will go back to the past in a different way. Watch the next episode to see what happens when I find the diary hidden in the floor of the secret room, and the truth almost drives me crazy. Hello everyone. Before we get started, make sure to like and subscribe and leave a comment saying where you're from and when you watched. That way, YouTube will continue to show you stories like this. Now, let's get started. Asterisk, I held Thomas' diary in my hand and looked at each crumpled page. The red lines were stained like old blood. The loop was almost complete, just needing one more person. I knew I was holding the last link. I didn't know if burning this book would actually break the ritual, but I felt that if I let it exist any longer, I wouldn't be sane enough to escape it. I prepared a metal basin and placed it in the middle of the secret room. I wrapped the diary in a layer of old newspaper and lit it. The fire flared up more fiercely than I expected. The smell of burning paper mixed with the smell of rotting leather and a stench like burnt hair made me nauseous. But I didn't take my eyes off the fire. The pages twisted and shriveled into ashes, but then I realized something horrifying. The fire didn't burn evenly like normal. There was a page that kept burning and then burning and then burning and never stopped. I used a small iron bar to pick it up and saw a layer of red ink appear, gradually becoming darker with each stroke, as if it was regenerating. On the half-burned paper, a new line of text tone appeared right before my eyes. "You are not allowed to erase." Yusi felt the floor shake slightly. The heat in the room no longer came from the fire, but from the walls themselves. The air thickened. The light from the flashlight began to flicker as if something was interfering. Then from the middle of the fire basin, the ashes flew up, forming a blurry spiral, and immediately after that, the sound of footsteps echoed from the four corners of the wall. I froze my whole body. Each heavy step slowly echoed as if the people who had been called were Now returning, I looked towards the corner of the room, which was always darker than the rest, and for the first time, I clearly saw a figure, black with no face, just a shape, floating in the darkness, not approaching, but I felt its gaze deep and cold. As I shouted, "I did not call you, I am not Thomas." There was no answer, just a terrifying silence. Then a voice from nowhere echoed around me throughout the room, "You are the last threat." After that sentence, the fire went out, everything, the light disappeared. The room was plunged into absolute darkness. I couldn't see my hands. I couldn't breathe, as if the air was being sucked out. An invisible force pressed on my chest, making me fall to the floor. I tried to crawl out of the room using all my strength to open the door before I passed out. I woke up the next morning on the living room floor. Everything was quiet, as if nothing had happened. But my hands were covered in ash. My shirt was scorched on my shoulder, and my left hand had a circular red burn. I walked to the secret room, but the door was closed, as if it had never been opened. I knocked but heard nothing, only my own echoey thought I had ended it, but deep in my heart I knew the loop hadn't stopped. I hadn't burned the truth, I had only touched the surface. Watch the next episode to see what happens when I receive an unsent letter with the same handwriting as Thomas and placed right on my pillow. Hello everyone. Before we get started, make sure to like and subscribe and leave a comment saying where you're from and when you watched. That way, YouTube will continue to show you stories like this. Now, let's get started. Asterisk, I thought that after all that had happened, burning the diary would be the end of the terrifying cycle in house number 44. But I was wrong. It had only just begun. The next morning, I woke up feeling extremely tired, as if I hadn't really rested all night. The sunlight was shining through the window. I reached out to pull the blanket up, and then I saw it. An old envelope was neatly placed on the pillow beside me. I sat up immediately, my heart pounding. The envelope had no sender, but the paper was yellowed and the edges were scorched, as if it had just been pulled out of a fire. Below the corner of the letter was a faint red circle. I opened it with trembling hands. Inside was a folded piece of paper. The handwriting was in black ink, with sharp, even curves, as if drawn with a knife. What made me freeze was that I recognized that handwriting. I had seen it before. In Thomas's diary, the first line of the letter read, "You can't escape without understanding." I continued reading, each line hitting my mind. Like thin blades, the replacement cannot choose his own role. No one can burn our memories. We are still here because we are youth. Last line of the letter made me put the paper down, not daring to read it again. Try to break what has been completed. Looked around the room. Everything seemed unchanged, but the feeling was completely different, as if I was no longer the owner of the house, but just a temporary resident in someone else's place. Tried to stay awake. Put the letter in the safe and checked the windows and doors. All were locked. No signs of being broken into. I live alone. No one has a key. No one can enter my house at night without leaving a trace. There is only one way to explain. The letter was not placed by a human. Flipped through each page of the diary I had taken in my phone, comparing the handwriting. Every curve, every way of writing the letters matched down to the smallest detail. There was no doubt that Thomas wrote it, and if so, that meant meaning he was still here that night. I didn't sleep. I sat in the living room with the tape recorder on and the camera facing the bed. Each tick of the clock became longer and slower, as if time was being stretched around. To 15 in the morning, the bedside lamp flickered slightly. I opened the camera to review the recording and saw, in the frame at the edge of the bed, a blurry figure appeared for a few seconds, and then disappeared when I slowed it down. I clearly saw a hand placing the letter down and then gently pulling it back without making a sound. I couldn't keep my composure anymore. I shouted to Thomas, "What do you want?" But there was no answer, just a small hiss coming from the tape recorder, like a distant whisper echoing off the walls. We weren't done. I didn't know who they were. I didn't know why Thomas had dragged me into this loop, but I knew if I didn't find the key, I would lose my mind. Or worse, become the next part of the ritual. I started tracing the history of the house through the owners, and I discovered a strange thing. Every person who lives here has at some point received an anonymous letter with no sender, and all have the same handwriting. I'm not the first to receive a letter, and I'm sure I won't be the last. Stay tuned for the next episode to find out what happens when I find out the secret of the only woman who ever survived moving into house number 44 and went missing just a week later. Hello everyone. Before we get started, make sure to like and subscribe and leave a comment saying where you're from and when you watched. That way, YouTube will continue to show you stories like this. Now, let's get started. Asterisk, I spent 3 days searching through the city and county archives for anyone who had lived at number 44. Except for the deaths listed in the death records, I found one name that stood out because ... There was no date of death. The records clearly stated that she had moved into number 44 in June 1963, and that she had left the house exactly 1 week later and had disappeared. No one knew how she had left, nor was there any record of her moving or contact from relatives. Her name was Eleanor Burke. Eleanor was then about 36 years old, a widowed elementary school teacher with no children. According to the records, she had no mental illness or criminal record. But since moving into number 44, she had gone to the local police station twice to report being followed and strange phenomena in the house. However, due to lack of evidence, the police did not accept the case as a formal investigation. But what made me shiver was a detail in the internal notes that was not made public on the last night Eleanor stayed at the neighbor's house. She heard screaming for 5 minutes, accompanied by banging on the door and breaking glass. But when they ran over, the house was completely silent. The next morning, the house was empty. No one was inside. The door was locked. There was no sign of a break-in or escape. The furniture was intact. Only one thing was lying in the middle of the living room table. Lay tape and a handwritten note. I found a copy of the recording in the police department's archives. It was a 4-minute long clip of a woman's voice speaking steadily and clearly. If anyone hears this recording, believe me, this house is not only haunted, it is alive. It sees, it feels, and it chooses the right person to complete what person started. I do not belong to it. I am not enough to complete the loop. But if you read this, you are the last person here. The tape cuts off. He sat there listening silently, listening to the recording in the living room where Eleanor had left her last words. It felt like the voice was still echoing through the walls. So I thought of the handwriting on the paper that someone had photographed and saved for the records. I compared it to the letter I had received a few nights before. They were perfectly similar. I couldn't understand. Did Eleanor never leave the house? Did she survive and was pulled in as part of that summoning ritual? Or ... Did she become the doorkeeper? Until I showed up that night, I didn't turn on the lights, didn't record or film. I just sat in the dark listening. I hoped Eleanor, if she still existed on some level of the soul, would appear and tell me the truth. 3 in the morning, I heard soft footsteps coming down the stairs to the kitchen. A soft female voice sounded as if from far away. Daniel, you know, right? I didn't answer. My heart was pounding so hard it made me suffocate. The voice continued. If you don't leave, the loop will close. Agune asked who she was, sir. Long silence, followed by one last echo. Had my chance, but I hesitated. Don't be like May. Turned on the light and rushed into the hallway. There was no one. I ran down to the kitchen, checking every window was still locked from the inside, but I knew the voice wasn't from this world. I went back to the living room. The light flickered one last time, then went out. In the darkness, I heard a small, sad laugh, and I realized Eleanor hadn't disappeared. She had just moved to another dimension. A part of the house waiting for me to do what she didn't dare watch. The next episode to see what happened when I first saw myself sitting in the living room from the security camera while I was still on the second floor. Hello, everyone. Before we get started, make sure to like and subscribe, and leave a comment saying where you're from and when you watched. That way, YouTube will continue to show you stories like this. Now, let's get started. Asterisk. After the last night of hearing the voice of the woman who called herself Eleanor, I woke up in a state of unrest. The house was as quiet as ever, but something in my heart had broken. This silence was no longer peaceful, but a whisper waiting for an unknown ending. I turned on all the security cameras that had been silently installed around the house for weeks. The footage was still fully saved, but there was a new file recorded at 3 in the morning that caught my attention. The exact moment I heard footsteps and a voice calling my name last night. I opened the video from the camera placed in the corner of the living room. The screen showed a dark room with only a faint light from the window. But what made me freeze was that there was a person sitting in the middle of the sofa. It was no one else but me. I rewinded each frame slowly. That person had the same sitting posture, the same hair, the same clothes I had worn last night. Even his left hand had a red circular burn mark, exactly like mine. I still didn't understand what I was looking at that moment. Definitely sleeping. On the second floor, I never left the room that night. He quickly turned on the second floor camera at that time to compare, and the frame clearly showed me lying motionless in bed with breathing and heart rate from the sleep monitor still recording. Normally so, who is the person in the living room? I can't call it an illusion. I can't say it's a dream because all the images and data recorded by the machine match. I sat silently for a long time in front of the screen, and in the frame behind the sitting clone suddenly appeared a blurry black shadow with no eyes but a white light in the eye sockets. The black shadow stood right behind my clone. Its hand lightly touched my shoulder and then disappeared. I began to wonder if I was still myself or not since entering this house. I have been confused between reality and illusion, between dreams and waking. I didn't dare to touch my hands. I didn't dare to look in the mirror. I was afraid that the thing living in this body was not completely May. Decided not to leave the house that day. I turned off all the lights except for a night light in the living room, then sat in the middle of the floor and placed the slow-motion camera pointing straight at May. Wanted to know if I sat here, would there be another copy of the image recorded for the first 2 hours? Nothing happened. I almost lost my patience and started to close my eyes. But just a few minutes later, I felt a cold air blowing on the back of my neck. I opened my eyes immediately, and in front of me was a mirror hanging on the wall, reflecting myself, but it wasn't exactly the same. The person in the mirror was still sitting there, but his eyes didn't blink and didn't follow me. He kept staring at me with empty eyes, a dull face and a smile gradually forming on his lips. I turned my head and there was no one. The mirror still reflected the room with only me sitting there. But when I raised my hand, the reflection didn't follow. I fell back in fear. My whole body cold as if being sucked into a weightless space. I ran out of the living room and back to the bedroom, slammed the door and sat with my back against the wall until morning, when I went back to watch the recorded video. I saw the image of myself sitting in the middle of the living room. Very clear, but there was a moment of frame stuttering, and for about 2 seconds, there were two identical people sitting there. No longer knew which was me and which was the reflection, or which was the thing summoned from the old. Rachel, I knew it wasn't over the house, wouldn't let me go watch the next episode to see what happened. When I found Thomas's old tape recorder that was still working and making sound even though there was no battery inside.